The dust settled on everything in Nelson, like a shroud over forgotten dreams. Naomi Carter pressed her trembling hand against the truck window, watching the endless expanse of New Zealand countryside stretch before them like a promise she wasn't sure she could trust. Her son Lucas sat beside her, his small fingers tracing invisible patterns on his worn backpack, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. The silence between them carried the weight of everything they'd left behind, the bruises that had finally faded, the fear that hadn't, and the desperate hope that this remote corner of the world might offer what the rest had stolen from them. When the weathered sign reading Beckett Ranch appeared through the settling dusk, Naomi felt her heart stop. This was their last chance, their final refuge, and she knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever waited beyond that gate would change everything. Subscribe to discover if sanctuary comes with a price too high to pay. The truck's engine coughed its final breath as Naomi pulled into the gravel driveway of Beckett Ranch, the sound echoing across the vast emptiness like a death rattle. Through the cracked windshield, she could see a figure emerging from the shadows of the wraparound porch, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that rushing led to mistakes. The late afternoon sun cast everything in shades of amber and rust, painting the scene with the kind of beauty that made her chest ache with longing for something she couldn't name. Lucas hadn't spoken in 3 hours, his silence a familiar companion that both comforted and worried her in equal measure. She watched as he pressed his face against the cool glass, his breath fogging the window in small, perfect circles that disappeared as quickly as they formed. The man on the porch stopped at the top of the steps, his hands resting on the wooden railing, and even from this distance, Naomi could feel the weight of his gaze settling over them like a heavy blanket. The air outside the truck carried the scent of hay and something wilder, eucalyptus and the promise of rain that might never come. Naomi's legs trembled as she stepped onto the gravel, her worn sneakers crunching against stones that seemed to whisper secrets she wasn't ready to hear. Behind her, Lucas emerged slowly, his movements careful and measured, his eyes already cataloguing every detail of this new environment with the intensity that marked him as different from other children. The man on the porch descended the steps with fluid grace, each footfall deliberate and sure, and as he drew closer, Naomi could see the lines etched around his eyes, not from laughter, but from squinting into too many sunsets, searching for something that remained perpetually out of reach. His hair was dark with threads of silver, and his clothes spoke of a man who worked with his hands, who understood the language of soil and seasons. When he stopped 3 feet away from them, close enough for her to catch the scent of leather and something indefinably masculine, Naomi felt her breath catch in her throat like a bird trapped in a cage. "You must be Naomi Carter," he said, his voice carrying the rough edges of a man who spent more time talking to animals than people. His eyes, a startling shade of green that reminded her of deep forest pools, moved from her face to Lucas, who had positioned himself slightly behind her legs, one small hand clutching the fabric of her jeans. There was something in the way he looked at her son, not with the usual mixture of pity and discomfort that most people wore when they encountered Lucas's differences, but with a kind of careful assessment that spoke of understanding. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with all the things she couldn't say, how they'd driven for 2 days straight, how her savings had dwindled to less than $50, how the bruises on her ribs had finally healed, but the ones on her soul remained tender to the touch. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady, and watched as something shifted in his expression, a softening so subtle she might have imagined it. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of cattle and the promise of a storm building on the horizon. "I'm Rowan Beckett," he continued, extending a hand that was calloused and strong, marked by years of honest work under an unforgiving sun. When Naomi placed her palm against his, she felt a jolt of something electric and dangerous, a recognition that went deeper than mere attraction and into territory she wasn't prepared to navigate. His grip was firm but gentle, lasting just long enough for her to notice the way his thumb brushed across her knuckles before he released her. Lucas had moved closer to her side, his small body radiating the kind of tension that preceded either a meltdown or a moment of unexpected connection, and Naomi found herself holding her breath, waiting to see which way the scales would tip. The ranch house behind Rowan seemed to watch them with dark windows, its weathered boards telling stories of generations who had called this place home, who had loved and lost and somehow found the strength to continue. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on them, the sense that this moment would be remembered long after the dust had settled and the choices had been made. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too beautiful for the harsh reality of their situation. Naomi's stomach clenched with hunger and something deeper, a desperate need for safety that she'd carried so long it had become part of her DNA. She watched as Rowan's gaze moved between her and Lucas, taking in their worn clothes, the way her son's fingers moved in repetitive patterns against his leg, the careful distance she maintained even as she leaned toward the promise of shelter. There was something in his expression that made her think of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, calculating the distance to the bottom and the likelihood of surviving the fall. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of a decision that would change everything, though she didn't yet understand the full scope of what he was offering. The air between them hummed with possibility and danger in equal measure, and Naomi felt her heart begin to race with the terrible knowledge that whatever came next, there would be no going back. "I've got room for you both," Rowan said finally, his voice carrying undertones she couldn't quite decipher, "but I need you to understand something before you set foot in my house." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Naomi felt her chest tighten with a familiar fear that tasted of copper and regret. Lucas pressed closer to her side, his small hand finding hers with the unerring accuracy of a child who had learned to read the subtle shifts in his mother's emotional weather. The wind picked up again, sending dust devils dancing across the yard, and somewhere in the distance a horse whinnied with a sound that seemed to echo the loneliness that lived in all their hearts. Rowan's eyes never left her face as he spoke, and Naomi found herself caught between the desire to run and the terrible knowledge that there was nowhere left to go. The kitchen smelled of coffee, and something indefinably masculine, leather and wood smoke, and the lingering ghost of meals eaten in solitude. Naomi sat at the scarred wooden table, her hands wrapped around a mug that radiated warmth through her palms, while Lucas explored the room with the careful precision of a cartographer mapping uncharted territory. Every few seconds, her son would glance back at her, seeking reassurance that this new environment was safe, that the man who moved through his own space with quiet confidence wouldn't suddenly transform into the monster they'd fled. Rowan stood with his back to them, his broad shoulders filling out a flannel shirt that had seen better days, and Naomi found herself studying the way he moved. Economical, purposeful, like a man who had learned that wasted motion was a luxury he couldn't afford. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Through the window above the sink, she could see the sun setting behind rolling hills that seemed to go on forever, painting the world in shades of gold and shadow that made her chest ache with a longing she couldn't name. When Rowan finally turned to face them, his expression was unreadable, carved from stone and years of keeping his own counsel. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest, and Naomi felt the full weight of his attention settle over her like a physical thing. Lucas had found a collection of smooth stones arranged on the windowsill and was running his fingers over their surfaces with the kind of focused intensity that meant he was processing this new environment, cataloguing every texture and temperature for future reference. The sight of her son finding small comforts in this strange place made something tight in Naomi's chest begin to loosen. even as another part of her remained coiled and ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Rowan's eyes moved from Lucas back to her, and she saw something there that made her pulse quicken, not the predatory hunger she'd learned to recognize and fear, but something deeper and more complex, like a man looking at a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. The coffee in her mug had grown cold, but she continued to hold it, needing the anchor of something solid and warm in her hands. "You need to understand what you're agreeing to," Rowan said, his voice carrying the rough edges of a man who spent more time with animals than people. His words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with implications she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Naomi felt her throat constrict, memories of other men and their conditions flooding back with the force of a physical blow, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, to show him the strength that had carried her this far. Lucas had moved to stand beside her chair, his small hand resting on her shoulder with the kind of protective instinct that broke her heart and made her proud in equal measure. The kitchen around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for words that would either damn them or save them, and Naomi found herself caught between hope and terror in a way that made her feel dizzy and unmoored. The clock on the wall ticked with mechanical precision, marking the seconds that stretched like hours, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of cattle settling for the night. "This isn't charity," Rowan continued, pushing away from the counter to pace the length of the kitchen with restless energy that spoke of a man unaccustomed to having his space invaded. His boots made soft sounds against the worn linoleum, a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of her heart, and Naomi found herself tracking his movement with the kind of hypervigilance that had kept her alive through 2 years of marriage to a man who used his fists to make his points. There was something different about Rowan's energy, though, controlled rather than explosive, contained rather than chaotic, and she felt a small part of herself begin to relax, even as her rational mind screamed warnings. Lucas had begun to hum softly, a tuneless melody that meant he was feeling overwhelmed, but not yet at the breaking point, and Naomi reached up to stroke his hair with fingers that trembled only slightly. The gesture seemed to catch Rowan's attention, and she saw his expression soften almost imperceptibly, as if he was seeing something in their connection that resonated with some hidden part of himself. The air in the kitchen felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure, and Naomi knew that whatever he said next would determine the course of their lives. The words, when they came, were not what she expected, and yet somehow they felt inevitable, like the conclusion to a story she'd been reading without realizing it. "You can stay here, both of you, for as long as you need," Rowan said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment they'd created. His eyes never left her face as he continued, and Naomi felt herself leaning forward, despite every instinct that told her to run. "But I won't pretend this is just about giving you a place to sleep. I've been alone on this ranch for 5 years, and I'm tired of eating dinner by myself, tired of having conversations with horses and cattle because there's no one else to talk to." The honesty in his voice was like a physical blow, raw and unvarnished, and somehow more frightening than any threat could have been. Lucas had stopped humming, his small body going still in the way that meant he was listening with every fiber of his being, processing not just the words, but the emotions beneath them. The kitchen seemed to shrink around them, becoming intimate and dangerous, and Naomi felt her heart begin to race with the terrible knowledge that she was standing at the edge of a precipice with no clear view of the bottom. "I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give," Rowan said, taking a step closer to the table, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, the way his jaw tightened as if he was fighting some internal battle. His hands hung loose at his sides, and Naomi found herself cataloguing the scars that marked his knuckles, evidence of a life lived with purpose and consequence. The air between them hummed with tension and possibility, and she felt herself caught between the desire to flee and the terrible need to stay, to finally stop running and see what might grow in the space between fear and hope. Lucas had moved closer to her chair, his small body radiating the kind of protective energy that made her chest ache with love and pride. And she knew that whatever decision she made would affect not just her own future, but his as well. The weight of that responsibility settled over her like a mantle, heavy and inescapable, and she found herself looking into Rowan's eyes, searching for some sign of the man beneath the proposition, some indication that this might be the sanctuary they so desperately needed, rather than another kind of prison. The silence that followed his words seemed to stretch into eternity, filled with the sound of her own heartbeat and the distant call of night birds settling into the darkness beyond the windows. Naomi felt the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment. The decision to finally leave, the long drive through unfamiliar territory, the desperate hope that had led her to answer an ad for work on a remote ranch in New Zealand. Now, sitting in this kitchen that smelled of coffee and solitude, she understood that she was being offered something far more complex than simple employment, something that terrified and tempted her in equal measure. Lucas's hand found hers beneath the table, his small fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of trust that made her throat tighten with emotion, and she knew that whatever she decided, it would be with the full knowledge that she was choosing not just for herself, but for the small boy who had already endured too much change, too much uncertainty. The clock on the wall continued its relentless ticking, marking time that felt suspended between one breath and the next, and Naomi found herself poised on the edge of a decision that would either save them or destroy them both. Chapter 3. The Weight of Acceptance. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of the small room, casting long shadows across the wooden floor where Lucas sat arranging his collection of smooth stones in perfect rows. Naomi watched him from the narrow bed, her body still aching from the restless night spent wrestling with Rowan's proposition and the weight of their circumstances. The silence in the house felt different now, charged with an unspoken agreement that hung between them like morning mist over the distant mountains. She had made her choice in the darkness of the previous evening, whispering her acceptance to Rowan's broad back as he stood motionless by the kitchen window, and now the reality of what that meant settled over her like a heavy blanket she couldn't shake off. The sound of boots on the wooden porch announced Rowan's return from his morning chores, and Naomi felt her heart quicken with a mixture of anticipation and dread that she couldn't quite name. Lucas looked up from his stones as the front door opened, his sensitive ears picking up the subtle change in the house's rhythm that came with Rowan's presence. The boy had always been attuned to the emotional undercurrents around him, and Naomi could see the confusion flickering across his delicate features as he tried to process the tension that seemed to follow the tall farmer like a shadow. Rowan appeared in the doorway, his weathered hands still dusty from feeding the cattle, his dark eyes finding Naomi's with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. There was something different about him this morning, a softness around the edges of his usual stern demeanor that suggested her acceptance had affected him more deeply than he was willing to admit. He nodded once, a gesture so small it might have been missed by anyone else, but Naomi understood it as acknowledgement of the bridge they had crossed together in the darkness. The morning light revealed the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, and she wondered if he had slept as poorly as she had, wrestling with the implications of their arrangement. The breakfast that followed was a careful dance of avoidance and stolen glances, with Lucas serving as an unwitting buffer between the two adults who were still learning how to navigate this new territory they had entered. Rowan moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing simple fare, with hands that seemed too large for the delicate task of cracking eggs and buttering toast. Naomi found herself studying those hands, noting the calluses and scars that spoke of years of hard labor, wondering what stories they might tell if she had the courage to ask. Lucas ate his breakfast in small, measured bites, his attention divided between his food and the fascinating way the sunlight played across the scratched surface of the wooden table. The boy's presence seemed to soften something in Rowan's rigid posture, and Naomi caught glimpses of a gentleness that he kept carefully hidden beneath his gruff exterior. When Lucas accidentally knocked over his glass of milk, sending the white liquid spreading across the table in an expanding puddle, Naomi tensed for the explosion of anger that would have come from her ex-husband, but Rowan simply reached for a towel and began cleaning up the mess with patient, methodical movements. The afternoon brought with it a tour of the property that felt like a tentative exploration of boundaries and possibilities. Rowan led them through the sprawling acres of his ranch, his long strides adjusted to accommodate Lucas's shorter legs, and Naomi's careful steps in shoes that weren't designed for rough terrain. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, a tapestry of golden grass and weathered fence posts that seemed to hold secrets in their weathered wood. Lucas was enchanted by everything he saw, from the massive cattle that regarded them with curious brown eyes to the hawks that circled overhead on invisible currents of air. Rowan watched the boys wonder with something approaching amazement, as if he had forgotten that the world could be seen through such innocent eyes. When Lucas stopped to examine a particularly interesting rock formation, crouching down to trace the patterns in the stone with his small fingers, Rowan crouched beside him and began explaining the geological forces that had shaped the land over millions of years. His voice took on a different quality when he spoke to the child, losing its harsh edges and becoming something warmer, more human. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Naomi felt the weight of the evening approaching like a storm on the distant mountains. The unspoken terms of their agreement hung between her and Rowan like a bridge she would have to cross, and she found herself both dreading and anticipating what lay ahead. Lucas had fallen asleep in the truck on the way back to the house, his small body finally succumbing to the exhaustion of processing so many new experiences in a single day. Rowan carried the boy inside with surprising gentleness, his large hands cradling Lucas's sleeping form as if he were made of spun glass. Naomi followed behind, watching the careful way Rowan navigated the narrow hallway and settled Lucas onto the small bed in their shared room. The sight of this rough, solitary man handling her son with such tender care did something to her heart that she wasn't prepared for, cracking open defenses she had built over years of disappointment and betrayal. When Rowan straightened and turned to face her in the dim light of the bedroom, she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like vulnerability, and she realized that perhaps she wasn't the only one who was afraid of what the night might bring. The house settled into evening quiet around them as they moved through the rituals of preparing for bed, each acutely aware of the other's presence in the small space they now shared. Naomi tucked Lucas in with extra care, smoothing his hair and adjusting his blankets, while Rowan waited in the kitchen, giving them privacy for their bedtime routine. The boy stirred slightly as she kissed his forehead, murmuring something about rocks and hawks before settling back into deep sleep. When she finally emerged from the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her, she found Rowan standing by the window again, his silhouette dark against the star-filled sky. He turned as she approached, and in the lamplight she could see the uncertainty that he tried so hard to hide, the same fear and hope that churned in her own chest like a restless sea. They stood there for a long moment, two damaged souls on the threshold of something that could either heal them or break them completely, while outside the wind whispered through the grass and carried with it the promise of change. Chapter 4. Beneath the Surface. The days that followed blurred together like watercolors in the rain, each one bringing small revelations that chipped away at the walls they had built around their hearts. Naomi found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease, her body remembering skills she had learned as a child on her grandmother's farm before the world had taught her to be afraid. She helped with the morning chores, her hands learning the weight of feed buckets and the particular way the gate latch needed to be lifted to open properly. Rowan worked beside her in companionable silence, their movements gradually synchronizing like dancers learning a new routine. Lucas thrived in this environment, his sensitive nature finding peace in the predictable patterns of animal care and the vast open spaces that seemed to absorb his occasional outbursts without judgment. The boy had taken to following Rowan around the property like a small shadow, asking endless questions about everything from the migration patterns of birds to the proper way to mend a broken fence post. Rowan answered each query with patience that surprised even himself, finding in Lucas's curiosity a reminder of wonder he had thought lost forever. The evenings had become their own kind of ritual, a careful negotiation of intimacy and distance that left them both emotionally exhausted and strangely fulfilled. Rowan would wait until Lucas was deeply asleep before approaching Naomi, his movements deliberate and respectful, asking permission with his eyes before each touch. Their physical connection was tender and hesitant, two people learning to trust again after betrayal had taught them that vulnerability was dangerous. Naomi found herself surprised by Rowan's gentleness, the way his calloused hands could be so careful with her body, treating her like something precious rather than something to be conquered. In the darkness of his bedroom, with moonlight streaming through the windows and the sound of nightbirds calling in the distance, she began to understand that what was happening between them was more than just the fulfillment of their practical arrangement. There was healing in their quiet conversations afterward, in the way Rowan would trace patterns on her skin while she told him stories about Lucas's childhood, about the dreams she had abandoned when her marriage became a prison. He shared pieces of his own past in return, fragments of a life that had been marked by loss and disappointment, by choices that had led him to this isolated existence where he had convinced himself he needed no one. Lucas's presence continued to work its magic on Rowan's carefully constructed defenses, the boy's innocent observations cutting through years of cynicism like sunlight through storm clouds. One afternoon, while they were repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by the previous winter's storms, Lucas asked why Rowan lived alone when the house was big enough for a family. The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Naomi watched Rowan's face carefully, seeing the way his jaw tightened as he struggled with an answer. Finally, he told Lucas that sometimes people got hurt so badly that they forgot how to live with others, that loneliness became a habit that was hard to break. Lucas considered this with the serious expression he wore when processing complex information, then announced that his mother had been hurt too, but that she was getting better now that they were here. The simple wisdom of the child's observation left both adults speechless, and Naomi saw tears gathering in Rowan's eyes before he turned away to hammer another nail into the fence post with unnecessary force. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Rowan reached for her hand without speaking, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt like a promise neither of them was ready to voice. The small town of Nelson began to take notice of their arrangement, whispers following Naomi when she ventured into the general store for supplies or accompanied Lucas to the tiny library housed in the back of the community center. She could feel the weight of curious stares and hear the fragments of conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. The scandal of a single mother living with the reclusive Rowan Beckett provided endless fodder for speculation, and Naomi found herself caught between shame and defiance as she navigated the social minefield of small-town judgment. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who ran the post office, made pointed comments about the importance of proper moral examples for children, while the younger mothers at the library seemed torn between disapproval and envy. Naomi held her head high through it all, reminding herself that their opinions mattered less than the safety and happiness she had found for herself and Lucas. When she shared these encounters with Rowan, She was surprised by the fierce protectiveness that flashed in his eyes, the way his hands clenched into fists as if he wanted to fight the entire town for her honor. He told her that he had stopped caring about their opinions years ago, that the only judgment that mattered was her own, but she could see that their criticism affected him more than he wanted to admit. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday when Lucas had one of his episodes, the kind of overwhelming sensory overload that left him curled in a corner of the living room, rocking back and forth, while tears streamed down his face. Naomi had learned to navigate these moments with patience and understanding, but she was unprepared for Rowan's reaction when he found them there. Instead of the awkwardness or irritation she had expected, he quietly sat down on the floor nearby, not touching or speaking, just making his presence known as a steady, calming force. Gradually, Lucas's rocking slowed, and he began to respond to Rowan's soft-spoken observations about the rain patterns on the window and the way the cattle were huddled together for warmth in the pasture. When the episode finally passed, Lucas crawled into Rowan's lap without hesitation, seeking the comfort of strong arms and a steady heartbeat. Naomi watched through tears as this man, who claimed to know nothing about children, held her son with instinctive tenderness, murmuring words of reassurance that seemed to come from some deep well of compassion he had kept hidden even from himself. In that moment, she realized that what she felt for Rowan had moved far beyond gratitude or physical attraction into something that terrified her, with its intensity and potential for both joy and devastation. The night that followed was different from all the others, charged with an emotional intimacy that transformed their physical connection into something transcendent. When Rowan came to her room, she saw in his eyes the same recognition that she felt in her own heart, the understanding that they had crossed another threshold together. Their lovemaking was slow and reverent, a conversation conducted in touches and sighs that spoke of feelings too fragile to be voiced aloud. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Naomi found the courage to tell him about her ex-husband's violence, about the fear that had driven her to flee with Lucas in the middle of the night. Rowan listened without judgment, his arms tightening around her as if he could shield her from memories that still had the power to wound. When she finished speaking, he told her about his own ghosts, about the woman who had left him years ago because she couldn't handle the isolation of ranch life, about the child they had lost before it was born, and how that loss had convinced him that he was meant to be alone. They held each other through the remaining hours of darkness, two broken people finding in each other's arms a kind of healing that neither had believed possible, while outside the rain continued to fall like tears of release, washing the world clean. 3 weeks had passed like pages turning in a book she was afraid to finish reading. The routine they'd built felt both natural and impossible. Rowan leaving before dawn to tend his cattle, returning at sunset with dirt under his fingernails and something softer in his eyes each day. Lucas had claimed the front porch as his kingdom, arranging stones and watching clouds with the intensity of a scholar, but tonight felt different. The air carried the weight of an approaching storm, and with it, the tension that had been building between them like electricity before lightning strikes. Naomi stood at the kitchen window, watching Rowan repair a section of fence in the fading light, his movements efficient and sure. "He's fixing things," Lucas said from behind her, his voice carrying that peculiar wisdom that sometimes emerged from his silence. "Not just the fence, Mama. He's fixing the broken parts." She turned to find her son watching her with those two knowing eyes, and felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. When Rowan came inside, his shirt damp with sweat and his hair falling across his forehead, she was waiting. The kitchen felt smaller with him in it, the air thicker. He stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes finding hers across the space that had become both sanctuary and prison. "Naomi," he said, and her name sounded different in his mouth, not like a stranger's word, but like something he'd been practicing in private. The sound of it broke something loose inside her chest, something that had been holding her together through sheer force of will. "I can't keep pretending," she whispered, the words falling between them like stones into still water. "That this is just temporary. That you're just helping us. That I don't—" She couldn't finish, couldn't name the thing that had been growing between them like wildflowers in unexpected places. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, his hands finding her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his size and strength. "Then don't pretend," he said, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Don't pretend that this isn't exactly where you belong."